The atmospheric recycler in Section 7 made a sound like a dying Rigelian space whale having an argument with a malfunctioning hyperdrive. Jake Sullivan paused mid-bite of his synthetic ham sandwich and listened to the mechanical symphony of distress echoing through the ventilation shafts of Harmony's Edge. Somewhere in that cacophony of grinding gears and hissing pressure valves, he could identify at least 3 different problems that would require his immediate attention. "Well, there goes my lunch break," he muttered, wrapping the sandwich in its biodegradable wrapper and shoving it into his toolkit. The toolkit itself was a masterpiece of organized chaos, containing everything from quantum phase adjusters to a rubber duck that he swore helped him think through complex problems. His supervisor had stopped questioning Jake's methods after the incident with the malfunctioning artificial gravity generator, which Jake had somehow fixed using nothing but determination, a sonic screwdriver, and what appeared to be a paper clip from Earth's ancient past. The corridors of Harmony's Edge hummed with activity that would have been impossible to imagine just 50 years ago. Delegates from across the known galaxy wandered the pristine walkways, their various physiologies creating a living museum of evolutionary diversity. A group of methane-breathing Thoraxians floated past in their environmental suits, their translator devices chattering away in their native clicking language while they debated the finer points of trade route taxation. Behind them, a delegation of crystalline beings from the Andromeda spiral caught the light from the station's artificial suns, casting rainbow patterns across the walls that shifted and danced with their movements. Jake navigated through this interstellar crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had spent the last 2 years keeping this diplomatic marvel functioning. He nodded politely to a Centaurian ambassador whose horse-like lower body required specially reinforced flooring, sidestepped a heated discussion between 2 Vulcarian traders about the optimal temperature for storing quantum-locked cargo, and paused briefly to admire a small group of Alderaanian children who were pressing their faces against the massive viewing ports, watching ships arrive and depart in the busy traffic lanes surrounding the station. The main conference hall loomed ahead, its massive doors carved from a single piece of neutronium-infused crystal that supposedly came from the core of a collapsed star. Jake had always suspected this was marketing nonsense, but he had to admit the doors looked impressive enough to make even the most jaded diplomat feel small and insignificant. Which, according to his supervisor, was exactly the point. As the doors slid open with a satisfying whisper of perfectly calibrated hydraulics, Jake stepped into what could only be described as the most tense room in 3 star systems. The hall stretched out like a vast amphitheater, with seating arrangements that had been planned by xenobiologists, diplomats, and probably a few therapists specializing in interspecies anxiety disorders. Every delegation sat in carefully calculated positions that took into account everything from optimal breathing mixtures to the complex web of historical grievances that stretched back centuries. But Jake's attention was immediately drawn to the atmospheric recycler mounted high on the far wall, which was now producing a sound that could charitably be described as mechanical screaming. He pulled out his portable scanner and frowned at the readings. The primary filtration matrix was operating at 43% efficiency, the secondary backup systems were cycling erratically, and something was causing harmonic vibrations that threatened to shake loose every piece of precision equipment in the room. "Fantastic," he said to no one in particular, pulling his sonic wrench from his toolkit. Whoever designed this system obviously never heard of proper resonance dampening. As he began setting up his ladder, Jake became dimly aware that the usual diplomatic murmur had died down to an almost complete silence. He glanced around, wondering if perhaps the failing recycler was affecting the oxygen mixture more than his scanner indicated, but everyone seemed to be breathing just fine. In fact, they all seemed to be staring at something near the center of the hall. Following their collective gaze, Jake spotted what had captured everyone's attention. A single figure sat in the Zephyrian delegation section, and even from across the vast hall, she commanded attention like a gravitational anomaly. She wore what appeared to be ceremonial armor that gleamed with an inner light, as if the metal itself had been forged from captured starlight. Her posture suggested someone accustomed to command, and the way other delegates unconsciously leaned away from her direction created an almost perfect circle of empty space around her position. Jake shrugged and returned his attention to the recycler. Politics were way above his pay grade, and besides, atmospheric systems didn't fix themselves. He climbed his ladder and began the delicate process of removing the access panel, humming a half-remembered tune from his childhood on Europa Station. The panel came free with a satisfying click, revealing the complex maze of filtration matrices, quantum processors, and what appeared to be a small family of dust mites that had somehow evolved to survive in a sterile environment. "Well, hello there, little guys," Jake said cheerfully, carefully relocating the dust mites to a less critical location. "Sorry to disturb your home, but you're causing some serious airflow problems." His sonic wrench powered up with its characteristic whine, and Jake began the careful process of recalibrating the filtration matrices. The work required intense concentration, as one wrong adjustment could flood the hall with anything from pure nitrogen to the exotic atmosphere preferred by the silicon-based delegates from the Vega system. He found himself unconsciously providing a running commentary as he worked, a habit that had developed during his years of solitary maintenance duties. Primary matrix looking good, secondary matrix needs a complete realignment, and whoever installed this tertiary backup system obviously learned engineering from a cookbook, he muttered, making careful adjustments. Note to self, recommend a complete overhaul of the atmospheric distribution network before the next diplomatic crisis. Because there's always a next diplomatic crisis. The recycler's mechanical screaming gradually subsided to a more manageable mechanical grumbling, and Jake allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. There was something deeply satisfying about taking a broken system and making it work properly again, whether it was a simple door mechanism or the life support systems for 30,000 beings from across the galaxy. As he prepared to move on to the secondary filtration unit, Jake became aware that the silence in the hall had somehow become even more profound. He paused in his work and looked down at the assembled delegates, wondering if perhaps he had accidentally triggered some kind of emergency protocol. But everyone seemed healthy and alert, they were just all staring in the same direction with expressions that ranged from nervous anticipation to barely concealed terror. Following their gaze once again, Jake got his first clear look at the figure who seemed to be the center of attention. She was definitely humanoid, though her elegantly pointed ears marked her as Zephyrian. What struck him most was not her obvious physical presence or the way her armor seemed to shimmer with barely contained energy, but the profound isolation that surrounded her. In a hall filled with beings actively engaged in the delicate dance of diplomacy, she sat alone in her circle of empty space like a statue carved from living starlight. Jake scratched his head thoughtfully and returned to his work. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle situations he didn't understand was to focus on the things he could actually fix. And right now, that meant ensuring that everyone in this hall could continue breathing properly, regardless of their species, homeworld, or apparently intimidating reputation. The secondary filtration unit yielded to his ministrations with less resistance than the primary system, though it did require him to practically climb inside the recycler housing to reach the quantum processors that regulated atmospheric composition. From his new vantage point, wedged between a particle scrubber and what appeared to be a small fusion reactor, Jake could see the entire hall spread out below him like a three-dimensional map of galactic politics. "You know," he said to the fusion reactor, which hummed along contentedly, "from up here, everyone looks pretty much the same. Just a bunch of folks trying to figure out how to get along without blowing each other up. Can't be that complicated, right?" The fusion reactor, being an inanimate object, offered no opinion on the complexities of interstellar diplomacy. But Jake found that talking through problems, even to unresponsive machinery, helped him think more clearly. And right now, he was thinking that the tertiary atmospheric backup system was showing some very concerning readings that suggested it might fail spectacularly if he didn't address them immediately. "Right then," he said, pulling out his quantum phase adjuster and preparing to perform what amounted to surgery on a system that kept 30,000 beings breathing. "Let's see if we can prevent any dramatic mechanical failures today. The diplomatic corps has enough drama without my equipment adding to the excitement." The sonic wrench decided to betray Jake at precisely the worst possible moment, which seemed to be a universal constant when it came to maintenance equipment throughout the galaxy. One moment he was carefully adjusting the quantum resonance frequency of the tertiary backup system, and the next moment the wrench was emitting a feedback loop that would have made a banshee from the wailing nebula proud. The sound started as a low harmonic hum that Jake initially mistook for proper equipment function. Then it escalated to something resembling a small starship attempting to achieve warp speed while simultaneously having all its engines fall off. But the real disaster began when the feedback loop interfaced with every translator device in the conference hall, creating what could only be described as a linguistic catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. "Oh, come on, you worthless piece of Martian junk," Jake muttered, frantically trying to shut down the malfunctioning wrench. His words, amplified and broadcast through 17 different translation matrices, emerged from every delegate's communication device in a symphony of mechanical interpretation. The Thoraxian delegation heard Jake's complaint rendered in their native clicking language as what roughly translated to, "Behold, the sacred metal offspring of the Red War god refuses to grant victory." The Centaurians received a formal declaration that, "the honored copper descendant of the battle planet declines to provide conquest." The crystalline beings from Andromeda processed the statement as a complex mathematical equation expressing the relationship between tool efficiency and cosmic disappointment. Jake, completely unaware that his technical frustrations were being broadcast across the hall in languages he didn't even know existed, continued his increasingly creative commentary as he wrestled with the rebellious equipment. Seriously, what kind of engineer designs a quantum phase adjuster with a feedback resonance chamber that can't handle a simple harmonic overlap? Did they learn physics from a children's hologram? This observation triggered a cascade of translator malfunctions as the devices attempted to process concepts that didn't exist in certain languages. The Vulcarian traders began receiving updates about mythical education conducted by juvenile light spirits. A delegation of aquatic beings from the tidal worlds found their devices earnestly explaining that someone had questioned whether the builders possessed knowledge acquired from offspring holograms, which their cultural context interpreted as a grave insult involving the sacred spawning rituals of their ancestors. Meanwhile, Princess Lyralii sat in her circle of enforced solitude, watching the chaos unfold with what started as mild curiosity and gradually transformed into genuine amusement. Her telepathic abilities, usually kept under strict control, couldn't help but pick up the waves of confusion and panic rippling through the assembled delegates. But underneath it all, she sensed something else entirely from the human dangling upside down from the atmospheric recycler, complete and utter bewilderment mixed with a peculiar kind of professional pride. Jake's sonic wrench reached a crescendo of mechanical rebellion, producing a sound that managed to activate the emergency karaoke protocol that some optimistic engineer had apparently built into the station's entertainment systems. The opening bars of what sounded suspiciously like a Terran love ballad began echoing through the hall in 12-part harmony, with each species translation device contributing its own unique interpretation of the melody. "Are you kidding me right now?" Jake shouted over the impromptu musical performance, still hanging upside down and now frantically attempting to disconnect his wrench from the atmospheric system before it could cause any more chaos. Emergency karaoke protocol? What kind of maniac designs emergency karaoke protocol into a diplomatic station? His rhetorical question was faithfully translated and broadcast, causing the Rigelian ambassador to begin what appeared to be a formal response defending the musical traditions of their homeworld, while a group of elderly Alderaanian diplomats started swaying gently to the rhythm, apparently convinced that this was some new form of interpretive negotiation technique. The situation reached peak absurdity when a Vulcarian trade representative, his translator device now completely convinced that the entire event was a formal musical challenge, began attempting to harmonize with the background music in what sounded like a cross between opera and the mating call of a deep space shipping container. This triggered a sympathetic response from the Thoraxian delegation, who began their own traditional war chant, which their translator devices helpfully rendered as a recipe for preparing fermented combat vegetables. Princess Lyralii found herself doing something she hadn't done in public for at least 3 years. She started laughing. Not the polite, diplomatic laughter that was expected at formal functions, but genuine, uncontrolled amusement at the magnificent absurdity of the situation. The sound of her laughter, so unexpected and uncharacteristic, caused several nearby delegates to stop mid-panic and stare at her in shock. Jake, still struggling with his rebellious equipment and now accompanied by an increasingly elaborate musical soundtrack, finally managed to disengage the sonic wrench from the atmospheric system. The feedback loop cut off abruptly, leaving the hall filled with nothing but the continuing karaoke performance and the confused murmurs of delegates trying to figure out what had just happened. "There we go," Jake said with satisfaction, completely oblivious to the diplomatic chaos he had inadvertently created. "Sometimes you just have to show these machines who's boss. Though I have to admit, I have no idea why that activated the music system. Station engineers these days, they connect everything to everything else and then act surprised when you get unexpected system interactions." As he spoke, Jake became gradually aware that the usual diplomatic murmur had been replaced by something that sounded like a combination of confused babbling, intermittent singing, and what might have been the sound of several ambassadors trying to simultaneously apologize and explain their way out of whatever they thought they had just committed to during the translation chaos. He looked down from his perch inside the atmospheric recycler and realized that every single being in the hall was staring at him with expressions ranging from bewilderment to horror to what appeared to be reluctant admiration. The karaoke system was still playing softly in the background, cycling through what seemed to be the greatest hits of 17 different civilizations, creating a surreal soundtrack for the diplomatic aftermath. Jake said, suddenly feeling like he might have missed something important. "Is everything okay down there? Did I accidentally shut off the oxygen or something?" Because everyone looks a little confused. This observation was picked up by the still-functioning translator devices and rendered into various languages as everything from a medical inquiry about atmospheric composition to what the Centaurians interpreted as a formal question about the mental state of their entire delegation. Several ambassadors began earnestly assuring Jake that their cognitive functions were operating within normal parameters, while others started discussing the philosophical implications of confusion as a diplomatic strategy. Princess Lyralii watched the human with growing fascination. Here was someone who had just caused the most spectacular diplomatic disruption in recent memory, and his primary concern seemed to be whether he had inadvertently endangered anyone's health. She could sense his genuine worry and confusion through her telepathic abilities, along with an almost endearing desire to fix whatever he thought he might have broken. Jake began climbing down from the recycler, his toolkit clanking against the ladder rungs as he descended. "Look, if I broke something important, I can probably fix it," he called out to the assembled delegates, most of whom were still trying to reset their translator devices and figure out what they had agreed to during the chaos. "I mean, that's literally what they pay me for. Well, that and making sure everyone can breathe properly, which I think I've got handled now." As his feet touched the floor of the conference hall, Jake looked around at the sea of staring faces and suddenly realized that perhaps he had wandered into something more complex than a simple mechanical failure. The Zephyrian princess, he noticed, was watching him with an expression that seemed curious rather than hostile, which he took as a good sign since everyone else seemed to be treating her like a live gravitational anomaly. "So," Jake said, pulling a spare energy cell from his toolkit and holding it up hopefully, "does anyone need their translator device recharged? Because I'm pretty sure some of these older models might need a power boost after whatever just happened. No charge for the service call, obviously, since I'm pretty sure this whole thing was my fault somehow." The offer to provide free technical support to an assemblage of galactic diplomats struck Princess Lyralii as possibly the most refreshingly honest response to a crisis she had ever witnessed. And as Jake approached the delegates with nothing but genuine concern and a pocket full of spare parts, she found herself genuinely curious about what would happen next. Jake approached the circle of empty space around Princess Lyralii with the same casual confidence he brought to repairing malfunctioning quantum processors. Which is to say, he walked forward without any particular awareness that he was about to do something that would have made seasoned diplomats break out in nervous sweats and caused at least 3 different security protocols to activate simultaneously. "Excuse me," he said, stopping just outside the invisible boundary that every other delegate had instinctively maintained around the Zephyrian princess. "I couldn't help but notice that your armor's environmental systems are running a little hot. That's probably pretty uncomfortable in this humidity, right?" Princess Lyralii stared at him for what felt like approximately 17 different eternities compressed into a single moment. Her mind, trained from childhood to analyze threats and calculate political advantages, found itself completely unprepared for someone whose primary concern appeared to be her personal comfort rather than her reputation as the most formidable military commander in 3-star systems. Jake, interpreting her silence as confirmation of his technical assessment, pulled out his portable scanner and held it up hopefully. I mean, I know Zephyrian physiology runs a bit cooler than human baseline, and these environmental suits are notorious for not adapting properly to mixed atmosphere stations. I could probably recalibrate your thermal regulators if you want. Wouldn't take more than a few minutes. Every diplomat in the hall held their breath. Security personnel from 4 different species discreetly moved their hands closer to their weapons. The Thoraxian delegation began what appeared to be a protective prayer ritual, while the Centaurians started backing slowly toward the exits. Even the crystalline beings from Andromeda seemed to dim their natural luminescence in anticipation of whatever catastrophic event was about to unfold. Princess Lyraliai's telepathic abilities, usually maintained under strict mental discipline, couldn't help but brush against Jake's surface thoughts. What she found there made her pause in complete bewilderment. He wasn't calculating political angles or trying to impress her or demonstrate dominance. His mind was genuinely occupied with thermal dynamics, humidity coefficients, and a sincere concern that she might be physically uncomfortable. There was also something about synthetic coffee and a half-eaten sandwich, but mostly he seemed worried that her environmental systems weren't functioning optimally. "You're concerned about my armor's climate control," she said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense when spoken aloud. "Well, yeah," Jake replied, apparently missing the fact that this was the first time anyone in the hall had heard the princess speak without issuing either a military command or a diplomatic ultimatum. "I mean, these older ceremonial suits look impressive, but they're terrible for actual climate management. Plus, the quantum field generators in your gauntlets are probably adding extra heat load to the system. I bet the internal temperature is running at least 5 degrees above your comfort zone." Jake was absolutely correct about the temperature, which Princess Lyraliai found almost as disconcerting as his complete lack of fear. She had been enduring the uncomfortable heat for the past 3 hours rather than show any sign of weakness or discomfort in front of the assembled delegates. The fact that a human maintenance engineer had diagnosed her problem from across the hall while hanging upside down from an atmospheric recycler struck her as either remarkably observant or completely insane. "Your assessment is accurate," she admitted, which caused several nearby ambassadors to quietly update their emergency evacuation plans. Jake beamed at her like she had just confirmed his calculations for a particularly complex engineering project. "I thought so. Look, I've got a portable thermal adjuster right here in my toolkit. It's designed for exactly this kind of situation. All I need to do is interface with your suit's environmental controls and recalibrate the thermal regulators to account for the station's atmospheric composition." He reached into his toolkit and pulled out what appeared to be a compact device covered in blinking lights and small mechanical appendages. "This little guy can handle pretty much any environmental suit manufactured in the last 50 years. I used it just last week to help a Vulcarian trader whose life support system was malfunctioning. Poor guy was practically freezing to death in his own suit." Princess Lyraliai found herself in the unprecedented situation of being offered genuine technical assistance by someone who apparently had no idea who she was or why everyone else was maintaining a respectful distance. Her political training screamed warnings about potential assassination attempts or elaborate schemes to compromise her equipment. But her telepathic abilities detected nothing but straightforward engineering enthusiasm and a desire to solve a practical problem. "You would need to make physical contact with my armor to perform this calibration," she said, testing his response. "Oh, just briefly," Jake assured her, completely missing the significance of what he was suggesting. "The thermal adjuster interfaces through skin contact to read your biosignatures, then it can optimize the environmental controls for your specific physiology. Takes maybe 30 seconds, and then you'll be much more comfortable for the rest of the conference." The hall had gone so quiet that the background hum of the life support system sounded like a freight hauler preparing for hyperspace jump. Princess Lyraliai looked at Jake's outstretched hand, holding the thermal adjuster with the same casual confidence that other people might use to offer a glass of water. In her entire adult life, physical contact had meant either combat training, assassination attempts, or carefully choreographed diplomatic protocols designed to demonstrate political relationships. But this human engineer was offering to touch her for the simple purpose of making her more comfortable. "Very well," she said, extending her gauntlet hand toward his. The moment their hands made contact, several things happened simultaneously. Jake's thermal adjuster began its biosignature scan, humming quietly as it analyzed Zephyrian physiology and calculated optimal environmental parameters. Princess Lyralii experienced the novel sensation of being touched by someone whose only agenda was solving a technical problem. And her telepathic abilities, despite her best efforts to maintain control, briefly connected with Jake's mind. What she found there was unlike anything she had ever encountered. Jake's thoughts were a chaotic but cheerful mixture of engineering principles, genuine concern for other people's well-being, and an almost childlike fascination with how things worked. There was no fear of her, no calculation of political advantage, no hidden agenda beyond making sure everyone on the station could breathe properly and stay comfortable. His mind felt like a warm, cluttered workshop where problems were puzzles to be solved rather than threats to be eliminated. Jake, for his part, felt a brief flutter of something that wasn't quite thought but wasn't quite emotion either. For just a moment, he sensed a vast loneliness that made his heart ache, followed by a curious warmth that felt like the mental equivalent of someone very carefully opening a door that had been locked for a very long time. "Wow," he said softly, not entirely sure what he was responding to. "That's different." The thermal adjuster completed its scan with a satisfied beep, and Jake's device began making the necessary adjustments to Princess Lyralii's environmental controls. "There we go," he said, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had just participated in what was probably the most closely watched hand-holding session in galactic diplomatic history. "Your suit should start cooling down in just a few seconds. Much better, right?" Princess Lyralii felt the immediate relief as her armor's environmental systems adjusted to optimal parameters, but more importantly, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Someone had touched her simply to help her, with no ulterior motive beyond basic kindness. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with thermal regulation. Jake was about to respond when his malfunctioning sonic wrench, apparently feeling left out of the moment, decided to have one final mechanical seizure. The device shot a beam of coherent energy across the hall, striking the station's central computer core with enough force to activate what appeared to be every entertainment protocol simultaneously. The lights dimmed to romantic mood lighting. Holographic fireworks exploded overhead in 17 different colors. The karaoke system launched into what sounded like the galactic hit parade, and somewhere in the background, a mechanical voice began announcing that the station's recreational facilities were now open for speed dating, competitive zero-gravity chess, and something called interspecies interpretive dance night. Jake stared at his rebellious wrench in horror. "Oh, come on. What is wrong with this thing today?" Princess Lyralii, still holding his hand and surrounded by the most absurd romantic light show in diplomatic history, did something that shocked every delegate in the hall. She started laughing again. But this time, she wasn't trying to control it or hide it or maintain her diplomatic composure. She laughed like someone who had just discovered that the universe was far more ridiculous and wonderful than she had ever imagined. And Jake, looking at her genuine amusement and listening to the station's computer cheerfully announce that the next waltz would begin in 5 minutes, found himself laughing too. The observation deck of Harmony's Edge offered a panoramic view of the binary star system that served as the neutral meeting point for half the galaxy's diplomatic corps. Jake had suggested they relocate there after his sonic wrench finally gave up completely, shooting one last defiant spark before going permanently silent. He claimed he needed to recalibrate the atmospheric processors without causing another interdisciplinary karaoke incident, but Princess Lyralii suspected his real motivation was curiosity about their unexpected connection. "So," Jake said, pulling apart the deceased sonic wrench with the focused attention of a forensic investigator, "I'm guessing that telepathic thing isn't something that happens to you very often with random maintenance engineers." Princess Lyralii settled onto one of the observation benches, her armor's newly optimized environmental systems keeping her perfectly comfortable for the first time in hours. "Random maintenance engineers don't typically approach me at all," she replied. "Most people seem to find my presence unsettling." Jake looked up from his disassembled tool, bits of quantum circuitry scattered across his lap like the remains of a very small technological explosion. Really? I mean, you seem pretty normal to me. Well, except for the telepathy and the fact that your armor could probably power a small space station. But personality-wise, you're just someone who's been stuck in uncomfortable clothes at a boring meeting. The casual observation made Lyralii laugh, a sound that was becoming more natural each time it happened. You have a remarkable talent for reducing complex situations to their essential elements. It's an engineering thing, Jake said, attempting to coax some life back into a particularly stubborn quantum processor. Most problems look really complicated until you figure out what's actually broken. Then it's usually something simple, like a loose connection or a component that's trying to do 3 jobs at once. He paused in his work and looked at her directly. Can I ask you something? And feel free to tell me it's none of my business, because it probably isn't. Lyralii nodded, genuinely curious about what question this remarkable human would ask. Why does everyone act like you're about to explode or declare war or something? I mean, I get that you're obviously important and probably very good at whatever you do, but the way people were acting in there, you'd think you were some kind of dangerous weapon instead of just a person. The question hit closer to home than Jake probably realized. Lyralii found herself considering how to explain a lifetime of careful isolation, political necessity, and the exhausting burden of being feared rather than known. I suppose I've become very good at being intimidating, she said finally. When you're responsible for military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations that affect billions of lives, it becomes easier to maintain distance than to risk the complications of personal connections. Jake made a skeptical noise as he reconnected some circuitry. That sounds like the most elaborate way of avoiding social interaction I've ever heard. I mean, I get that your job is probably stressful, but don't you ever just want to talk to someone without them calculating political angles? Until today, I wasn't sure such conversations were possible. Jake's hand stilled on his repair work. What's it like? The telepathy, I mean. When we touched earlier, I felt something. Like there was more going on than just the thermal calibration. Lyralii considered her response carefully. Your mind is unlike anything I've ever encountered. Most people's thoughts are layered with calculation, hidden agendas, fear, or desire for advantage. But your mental landscape feels like. She paused, searching for the right comparison. Like a workshop where someone genuinely enjoys solving problems for the simple pleasure of making things work better. Huh, Jake said, apparently taking this as a compliment. I've never thought of my brain as a workshop, but I guess that makes sense. Everything's kind of scattered around, but I usually know where to find what I need. He successfully coaxed a weak glow from the quantum processor and grinned with satisfaction. There we go. Not exactly field ready, but at least it's not completely dead. He looked back at Lyralii. So what happens now? I mean, after the diplomatic thing is over. Do you go back to being intimidating and untouchable? The question struck at the heart of something Lyralii had been avoiding thinking about. I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. Jake set down his partially repaired tool and gave her his full attention. Well, maybe you could start with something simple. Like, I don't know, having a conversation with someone who doesn't want anything from you except maybe some help figuring out why the coffee synthesizers on this station produce something that tastes like recycled lubricant. You're suggesting I learn to be normal by complaining about synthetic beverages? I'm suggesting you learn to be yourself by doing things that don't have anything to do with military strategy or diplomatic consequences. When's the last time you did something just because it seemed interesting, not because it served some greater political purpose? Lyralii realized she couldn't answer that question. Every choice she had made for years had been filtered through considerations of duty, responsibility, and political necessity. The idea of acting on simple curiosity or personal preference felt foreign and slightly terrifying. I used to enjoy fixing things, she said quietly. Before I became responsible for commanding fleets and negotiating treaties, I spent hours in the engineering sections of ships, learning how systems worked and how to repair them when they failed. Jake's face lit up like she had just revealed a shared passion for ancient Earth music or quantum mechanics. Really? What kind of systems? Hyperdrive motivators, primarily. There's something satisfying about the precision required to calibrate a quantum field generator for optimal efficiency. No kidding. I've been working on hyperdrive systems since I was 12. My dad was a ship engineer, and he used to let me help with routine maintenance. Jake's enthusiasm was infectious, and Lyralii found herself drawn into a technical discussion that had nothing to do with politics or military strategy. They spent the next hour comparing notes on quantum field dynamics, sharing stories about particularly challenging repair jobs, and debating the merits of different approaches to hyperdrive calibration. Jake discovered that Princess Lyralii had an intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics that most professional engineers would envy, while she learned that his unconventional problem-solving methods often produced better results than standard procedures. "You know," Jake said as they watched ships arrive and depart in the busy traffic lanes outside the observation deck, "you're probably the only person I've ever met who understands why I always carry a rubber duck in my toolkit." Explaining problems to an inanimate object helps clarify your thinking process, Lyralii said immediately. "I use a small crystal formation for the same purpose." Exactly. Most people think I'm crazy, but sometimes you need something to talk to that won't offer advice or try to solve the problem for you. Lyralii smiled, realizing how natural this felt. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation sometime. I find myself curious about your approach to quantum resonance calibration." Jake grinned and pulled out a spare energy cell from his toolkit. "Tell you what, why don't we start with something even simpler? How about we go find some of that terrible synthetic coffee and you can tell me what it's really like being a princess who commands starfleets. And I'll explain why I think the person who designed this station's emergency protocols had a seriously questionable sense of humor." Princess Lyralii stood up, her armor moving with silent efficiency as she extended her hand toward Jake. This time, there was no pretense of technical assistance or diplomatic necessity. She was simply choosing to trust someone who had approached her with kindness instead of fear. "I would like that very much," she said. Jake took her hand without hesitation, and they walked together toward the corridors that would take them back into the bustling heart of the station. Behind them, the binary stars continued their ancient dance, and ahead of them, the diplomatic corps was probably still trying to figure out what had happened during the Great Translation Catastrophe of 2387. As they passed a group of Centaurian diplomats who were earnestly discussing the philosophical implications of emergency karaoke protocols, Jake leaned over and whispered, "You know, I think this might be the beginning of a beautiful friendship." Princess Lyralii squeezed his hand gently, her telepathic abilities picking up his genuine warmth and the remarkable absence of any agenda beyond simple human connection. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like someone had seen her not as a political entity or a military asset, but simply as a person worth knowing. "I believe you may be right," she said, and meant it completely.